Hello, guys, and welcome to class. Today, we're going to be talking about the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was founded a lot like with Jamestown by a joint stock company. Remember 1607? It was the Virginia company that actually funded the Jamestown expedition. And that way, not one person like Sir Walter Raleigh with the Roanoke settlement was taking on all of the risk. Well, similarly, here of Massachusetts Bay, you're going to have a group of investors. This is going to be the New England Company, who are going to be paying the way for a lot of Puritans to be heading over to Massachusetts, which will be in this area named by John Smith, New England. So remember, we had last time we talked about the Pilgrims coming over, and we talked about how there were different groups of Puritans that you need to know about in the Massachusetts area. Massachusetts is a state today, it's a colony back during colonial times, but there are two significant Puritan groups that are going to be settling there. You have in Plymouth the landing of the Pilgrims in about 1620. They do the Mayflower Compact and they land. They have the first Thanksgiving with natives. And remember, they are Puritan separatists. They want to completely break away from the Church of England. They don't agree with its doctrine, its idolatry, or any of its other facets. The other group of Puritans who's going to be coming over are going to be this Massachusetts Bay group. And these Puritans we'll just call the Puritans because they want to purify the Church of England. They don't want to actually separate from it. And this is going to be by far the much, much larger group, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So think its headquarters is like Boston versus the Pilgrims, think like Plymouth. Okay. Those are two separate areas that we're going to be talking about here in Massachusetts, this New England colony. This is up north. Okay. So about 10 years after the Pilgrims come over, this big Puritan group comes over. So 1629, five ships, their flagship, the Arabella. Their leader of this first settlement group is a man named John Winthrop. And before they even touch down, while they're still on this flagship Arabella, John Winthrop gives this really important speech, from a sermon in the Bible. It's titled City on a Hill. And in his City on a Hill speech, he basically talks about, and we'll take a much closer look at this in class, about how what the Puritans are trying to set up is going to be a model for Puritanism throughout the world. And if they fail, it will also reflect a failure of Puritan ideas, so they cannot fail. That's basically the stakes that he's setting. And now this speech is also really important as far as its legacy goes. It's been used many times. Many different American presidents, including John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, have actually used this speech and many of their famous speeches in the 20th century and beyond. And it's been misquoted a lot. A lot of people don't understand the Puritan ideas or the context historically that the Puritans were in when they came over, especially their notions of religious freedom. Like we talked about last time with the Pilgrims, Puritan ideas of religious freedom and why they were coming over to seek, a new world, a new place to call home, aren't exactly what we were led to believe when you're kids. For the Puritans, they wanted the freedom to practice their faith the way they saw it, free from outside influence. Versus persecution, there was definitely persecution. That's why many come over. But for many of them, it's that reason I just mentioned. They want to practice their faith without outside influence, and they don't tolerate other faiths. This is going to be a very strict, very religiously oriented society. That's why we call this Massachusetts Bay Colony and what they established the Bible Commonwealth. It will be very strict. Now, again, just like the Pilgrims, in this New England company, this group that's sent over, it's about 1,000 in the first group, and then um, over the course of the next decade or so, until about the 1640s, when the English Civil War begins, you're going to have almost 21,000 Puritans coming to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this colony grows in population just at a staggering rate due to a much healthier climate, less mosquitoes, and they're settling in family groups. But not all of the people that are coming over are going to be Puritans, okay? Many of those that are coming over on these ships are the sailors. Many are carpenters interested in the rich lumber industry in New England, lots of trees there. And many are interested in other forms of seeking profit. The fur trade was um, very active up in New England. Remember, beaver pelts were extremely wealthy. Um, and so, not all of those coming over are seeking this sort of religious freedom that the Puritans are. And there's going to already from the beginning be kind of the setup clash of cultures between those that are there seeking profit and those that are there seeking this religious autonomy. On this map here, hopefully you can see, we got the pilgrims coming over Cape Cod. They sail along looking for a place. Plymouth Rock, maybe that happened, maybe it didn't. But Plymouth is basically going to be where the pilgrims establish their colony. And they make alliances with the Wampanoag people. Massachusetts, named after the Massachusetts people. This is where the Massachusetts Bay Colony is going to be settling and branching out from Boston. And from there, they established Charlestown. There was an earlier settlement in Salem. Yes, that's Salem with the witches. We will talk about that later. And those people at the Salem colony, they will integrate in with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. There will eventually be a Salem village and a Salem town. Salem village is where the witches are going to happen. But that is all part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this whole area, all of this with Massachusetts, these are the Puritans. Remember, Puritan separatists, those are pilgrims, and just Puritans, those are going to be Massachusetts Bay Colony people. We talked about how they're coming over in family groups, much more so than like in the Chesapeake area with Virginia and Maryland. Um, Much larger families as well, even some grandparents, older people, and a lot of highly educated people as well. To be a minister, you have to be literate, of course, and they expect not just ministers, but every member of church. This is a church society, must be literate enough to discuss and debate the Bible, and to be able to internalize it on their own terms. So this is a much more highly educated populace than you'd have like in Virginia. Voting was tied to the church. Everything was centered around the church in Massachusetts society. To be a full church member, though, you had to have a conversion experience where you could basically testify that you had had this one on one, basically confirmation with God, where He'd spoken to you internally, of course. And once you'd had that conversion experience and you testified about it to the church leadership, you could be admitted as a full church member, which was a very big deal. You could be one of those, what was called a visible saint, if you've had that conversion experience. But however, to vote, it required even more than just being this full church member. You also had to be a man. Women could not vote in Massachusetts society. Women were definitely considered second class citizens, although they were encouraged and had to learn to read and write to be church members. Um, Women are definitely subservient to the husbands. In the household, the man's authority was supreme. He has to have control of his children and his family. Because remember, this is not a slave based plantation society. Their food they have to get from subsistence farming, and that has to come from the labor of the entire family. So, very patriarchal. Back to the voting. So, you had to be a man. You had to be a full church member, not just going to church, but a full church member with the conversion experience, so a visible saint, and you had to be land owning. But if you had those things, you were able to vote. And so this was actually a lot more liberal. There's going to be a lot more people able to vote in Massachusetts than like in Virginia. And remember the big difference here when we're talking about these colonies and just trying to review like how are they different, right? Virginia started off with the Virginia Company. Eventually, they get the House of Burgesses. These rich plantation owners can vote and stuff. But Virginia by 1624 was also, remember, a royal colony. So its authority flowed directly from the Crown of England. Originally, like when Maryland, that colony right above Virginia, when it was set up, it was a proprietary colony. So it was literally controlled by a single man, like a dictatorship almost. So Massachusetts here where you have a lot of these full church member male landowning guys able to vote. That was a lot more progressive. That's a lot more democratic than these other colonies. And that's also why it helps to explain later on Massachusetts is the hotbed for revolutionary fervor when we get into the American Revolution times. One other thing I want to mention on this that Massachusetts does maybe right, where the other colonies didn't, is that the New England companies, investors, the main guys, the proprietors of this company that sets up the colony, they did something smart in that they immigrated over with the colonists. They didn't stay back in London. They didn't stay back in England. They came over to Massachusetts with their charter, the paper granting them the authority to have this colony. So John Winthrop, he comes over with the colonists. He's leading them on the ground, and basically by taking that charter with them, they're telling the King of England, you know, if you want to tell us what to do or take back control of our colony, well, you'll have to come and pry it out of our cold, dead fingers all the way across the Atlantic. And so that will give them a lot of autonomy for a long time. It'll allow them to keep in control of themselves for much longer than these other colonies. With the church membership and the importance of reading the Bible and discussing it, there is a huge emphasis on education for both boys and girls in Massachusetts. And that helps to explain why it's in New England where you have the first university established, Harvard, in 1636. So that was not the first university in the New World. There was one established way beforehand by the Spanish in Mexico City, but Harvard is the first, and you have the first printing press established at Cambridge. All of this revolving around the church. Harvard was a university to train pastors and ministers for church service, and Cambridge to print off Bibles and other church um, literature. Since this Puritan lifestyle was extremely authoritative, basically they're telling you this is the way it's going to be, and they don't accept a lot of um, outside ideas or other religions. There's not a lot of religious toleration, ironically, in this colony that was set up for religious freedom for Puritans. Dissenters are going to have a rough time and will often be exiled from this colony. And we're just going to talk about a few of the important ones who go on to establish colonies of their own. So, famously, you have this woman named Anne Hutchinson. She immigrates over to the Massachusetts Bay Colony just a few years after it was set up. So, she's one of the early colonists there in Boston. She actually followed her pastor from London, man named John Cotton, who preached about absolute grace. And this was different from what a lot of the ministers in the Massachusetts Bay Colony were preaching at the time, which was about service. They preached that in order to be one of the elect, because remember, Puritanism is based on the ideas from John Calvin, the elect versus the damned. And a lot of the ministers in Hutchinson was accusing or saying were preaching that in order to be one of those elects, you had to do good service, like you had to also attend church regularly. If you didn't attend church, they said, then you're not one of the saved, one of the elect. You're bound for the bad place. And then Hutchinson said that that's wrong, that only through salvation, only through your relationship with God, only through grace, through God's grace, could you be saved, that it wasn't through good works. And it was wrong for these ministers to tell people otherwise. And she got very mouthy and she got quite a following. She was a midwife. She actually had 15, I'll repeat that, 15 children herself. Okay. And then as a midwife, that's a woman who helps other women have babies. She delivered countless babies there in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So she was very well known and appreciated. And she had a big following. A lot of people would come to her house, like over 100 men and women, to discuss the Bible and listen to her ideas about what these ministers were doing. And so she became a very radical force threatening to disrupt this authoritative Puritan community. And so eventually, her and some of the other ringleaders of this antinomianism scandal, it was called. Antinomianism is that they're basically being accused of spouting their own ideas that were not church dogma. They go on trial, and during the trial, I'm just going to read a little bit of it, but basically, this is this woman in this very patriarch society challenging the authority of the Puritans. Um, and she's actually going and being questioned by the governor of the colony himself, John Winthrop, the leader of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So here's just an excerpt from that. You are known to be a woman that have had a great share in the promoting and divulging of those opinions that are the cause of this trouble, and you have maintained a meeting and an assembly in your house that have been condemned by the General Assembly as a thing not tolerable nor comely on the sight of God, nor fitting for your sex. And Hutchinson says, That's a matter of conscience, sir. And Governor John Winthrop replies, Your conscience you must keep, or it must be kept for you. Da dang. So basically, Anne Hutchinson is a double threat. She not only represents a dissenting voice in the Massachusetts Bay Colony against these fundamental Puritan ideas, but she's also a woman questioning this male led society. And so eventually, what happens is that she will be exiled. Yes, exiled from the community. And she helps to set up Portsmouth in Rhode Island, along with this man we're going to talk about named Roger Williams, to help establish the Rhode Island colony. And eventually, because Massachusetts Bay threatens to overtake Rhode Island at one point, she goes even further into the Dutch colony, gets involved in the Dutch Indian Wars, and is killed by Native Americans along with 6 of her children. One surviving daughter, Susanna, is captured by Native Americans and survives and eventually gets her freedom.